sparks hissed from the hood of the $250,000 machine, sputtering against the damp asphalt. Kaylee gripped her phone, knuckles white, screaming at the stranger in the flannel shirt who had just dared to lay a grease-stained hand on her pristine fender. "Don't touch my car!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. She thought he was a scavenger on this empty mountain road. She didn't know her throat was about to close, or that this exhausted father was the only reason she'd live to see tomorrow. Carbon fiber and brushed aluminum offered no warmth as the ambient temperature of the cabin began to drop. Kaylee Madsen sat rigidly behind the steering wheel of her customized Audi R8, staring through the windshield at the dense, darkening tree line of the Cascade Range. 10 minutes ago, she had been a master of her universe, dictating terms of a hostile takeover via Bluetooth, the 600-horsepower engine humming a flawless, uninterrupted note beneath her. Now, she was just another stranded motorist enveloped in an uncomfortable, heavy silence. The failure had been catastrophic and instantaneous. There was no warning light, no sputtering, just a violent mechanical shudder that rattled her teeth, the acrid smell of burnt wiring. And then, nothing. The digital dashboard went black. The power steering seized. She had barely managed to muscle the heavy chassis onto the narrow shoulder of the mountain road before the tires ground to a halt in the loose gravel. Kaylee exhaled, watching her breath form a faint mist in the cold air. She rubbed her eyes, which burned from 12 hours of staring at spreadsheets and legal briefs. Her neck was stiff, the muscles pulled taut like piano wire beneath the collar of her Tom Ford silk blouse. She hated losing control. It was a physical sensation for her, a gnawing itch at the base of her skull. She tapped the dead touchscreen in the center console. She jabbed the push-to-start button 3 times. The car remained stubbornly, infuriatingly lifeless. "Useless," she muttered, the sound swallowed by the insulated cabin. She reached for her phone. No service. Of course. The digital bars at the top of the screen were entirely empty, a mocking reminder of her isolation. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat in disgust. It landed next to her leather briefcase and a half-eaten artisan energy bar she had bought at a boutique hotel that morning. Her stomach gave a hollow rumble. She picked up the bar, peeled back the gold foil with her teeth, and took a bite. It tasted like ash and too much salt, but she chewed mechanically. She needed the calories. She had skipped lunch to finalize the liquidation of a manufacturing plant in Ohio, effectively putting 300 people out of work. She hadn't felt guilty about it then, and she didn't feel guilty now. It was just math. But the math out here, on this desolate stretch of Highway 20, wasn't working in her favor. The sun was dipping below the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. The temperature was plunging. Kaylee swallowed the dense bite of the bar. A faint, prickly sensation bloomed at the back of her throat. She coughed, clearing it, attributing the irritation to the dry mountain air and the stress of the day. She needed a plan. She pulled the door handle, expecting the familiar, heavy thunk of the precision-engineered latch. It didn't budge. She pulled harder. Nothing. Frowning, she located the electronic unlock button on the door panel. She pressed it. Silence. The catastrophic electrical failure had triggered the hypercar's anti-theft deadlocks. The doors were sealed. A cold spike of adrenaline finally pierced her irritation. She was locked inside. She leaned back against the headrest, closing her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Logic, she told herself. There is a manual override. There is always a manual override. But the owner's manual was in the glove box, and the glove box operated on the same dead electrical circuit as the doors. The prickly sensation in her throat thickened. It felt like she had swallowed a mouthful of wool. She coughed again, a dry, harsh sound. She looked down at the wrapper of the energy bar. Her vision blurred slightly in the dimming light as she read the fine print. Manufactured in a facility that processes peanuts, tree nuts, and cashews. Kaylee's heart skipped a beat. Cashews. She hadn't had a reaction in 15 years, not since college, but her allergy was severe. She always carried an EpiPen. It was in her purse, and her purse was locked in the trunk. Outside, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the mountain silence. Kaylee's head snapped up. Twin beams of yellow light swept across the trunk of the Audi, illuminating the swirling fog. A battered, rust-eaten Ford F-150 pulled onto the shoulder behind her, its diesel engine rattling like a tin can full of rocks. The headlights cut the engine, but the clattering idle remained. For a split second, relief washed over her. But as she watched the driver's side door of the truck groan open in her rearview mirror, the relief mutated into a sharp, defensive paranoia. She was alone, trapped in a $250,000 car, miles from civilization, as a stranger approached in the dark. Tinsley Guthrie stepped out of the truck, his worn work boots hitting the wet gravel with a heavy, exhausted thud. He stretched his back, grimacing as his lower spine popped in protest. He smelled like stale diner coffee, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, sweet scent of the apple juice his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, had spilled on his flannel shirt 3 days ago. He didn't want to stop. He had been driving for 4 hours after pulling a double shift, fixing industrial HVAC units in a windowless warehouse. His hands were cramped, grease permanently embedded in the deep cracks of his knuckles. He just wanted to get home, put Maya to bed, and stare at the ceiling while worrying about the $400 heating bill sitting on his kitchen counter. But Maya, strapped into her booster seat in the cab, had pointed a sticky finger at the sleek, dark shape on the side of the road. "Daddy, look. That car is sad." Tinsley had sighed, his foot easing off the accelerator. He knew a dead vehicle when he saw one. He grabbed a heavy maglite from the door pocket and walked toward the Audi. Up close, the car looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the dirt. The matte graphite paint absorbed the light, sleek and aggressive. He shined the flashlight over the hood, noticing the faint wisp of acrid smoke leaking from the panel gaps. Fried alternator, he guessed, or a complete wiring harness meltdown. He walked up to the driver's window and tapped the glass with 2 knuckles. Inside, Kaylee flinched. The man staring down at her looked rough. He had a scruffy beard, deep circles under his eyes, and a greasy baseball cap pulled low. To her hypersensitive, panicked brain, he didn't look like a savior. He looked like a liability. She found the window switch. Miraculously, there was just enough residual juice in the capacitor to lower the glass a fraction of an inch before it died completely with a pathetic click. "You need a tow?" Tinsley asked, his voice gravelly, leaning down to speak through the crack. "Looks like you cooked something good under there." Kaylee's throat hitched. The swelling was subtle but undeniable now. Her voice came out tight and defensive. "I'm fine. I have roadside assistance on the way." It was a blatant lie, but she wanted him gone. Tinsley raised an eyebrow. He glanced up at the sky, then down at his own phone. "Yeah? Because I ain't got a lick of service out here, lady, and tow trucks don't patrol the pass after dark." "They have my GPS coordinates," Kaylee snapped, her tone dripping with the instinctive commanding authority she used to decimate boardrooms. "I just need you to step away from the vehicle. Do not touch the car." Tinsley stared at her. He saw the expensive silk blouse, the diamond stud earrings catching the beam of his flashlight, the manicured nails gripping the steering wheel. He felt a sudden, hot flash of class resentment. Here he was, exhausted to his bones, trying to do the right thing, and this woman was treating him like a mugger. "Look, lady," Tinsley said, his patience evaporating. "You're parked on a blind curve. It's getting dark and the fog is rolling in. A logging truck comes barreling around that bend. They're going to peel this fancy toy of yours off the pavement like a tin can." I said, "Step back!" Kaylee's voice rose, cracking at the end. She coughed, a wet, struggling sound. Her chest felt like someone was tightening a leather belt around her ribs. She tried to swallow, but the back of her throat felt thick and raw. Tinsley didn't notice the cough. He only heard the dismissal. He took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Suit yourself. Freeze to death for all I care. I got a kid in the truck who needs her dinner." He turned his back on the Audi and started walking away, his boots crunching loudly in the quiet mountain air. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself people like her deserved a reality check. She could sit in her freezing, dead spaceship until the highway patrol found her in the morning. Inside the car, Kaylee watched him walk away. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through her wall of arrogance. She tried to call out to him, to tell him to wait, to tell him she was locked in. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. Her airway was closing. The cashew protein was flooding her system with histamines, sending her body into violent, catastrophic shock. She clawed at her own neck, her perfectly manicured nails leaving red, angry welts on her pale skin. She gasped, her lungs straining against an invisible barrier, desperate for oxygen. She threw herself against the driver's door, slamming her shoulder into the heavy panel. Thud. Thud. The sound was muffled by the thick acoustic glass. Tinsley was 10 feet from his truck when he heard the frantic, rhythmic thumping. He stopped. He closed his eyes, swearing under his breath. "Just keep walking, Tommy," he thought. "Not your circus." But the thumping grew wilder, more desperate. He turned around. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the driver's side window. Kaylee was no longer sitting rigidly upright. She was slumped against the glass, her face pale and contorted, her mouth open in a silent, desperate scream for air. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, wiped Tinsley's exhaustion away in a microsecond. He dropped the flashlight, leaving it rolling on the gravel, and sprinted back to the Audi. He grabbed the flush door handle and yanked. It was solid as a bank vault. "Hey!" he yelled, slamming the flat of his hand against the glass. "Hey! Open the door!" Kaylee's eyes were wide, terrified, and rapidly losing focus. Her lips were taking on a faint, sickening shade of blue. She weakly raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the rear of the car. The trunk. Tinsley understood instantly. Medical emergency. Medicine in the trunk. He ran to the back of the car, feeling blindly under the aerodynamic lip for a manual trunk release. Nothing. Just smooth, seamless carbon fiber. The entire car was a sealed electronic tomb. He ran back to the window. Kaylee was fading, her head lolling against the steering wheel. Her chest heaved, but her lungs weren't expanding. She had less than 2 minutes. Maybe less. Tinsley stepped back, sizing up the window. He could break it, but the Audi had dual-pane laminated security glass. Even if he swung a tire iron with all his might, it would shatter into a spiderweb. But it wouldn't give way easily. And if he did break through, the heavy glass would rain down on her, and he still wouldn't be able to open the deadlocked doors from the inside without power. He needed to get the trunk open. And to get the trunk open, he needed power. He sprinted back to his truck. He flung open the heavy metal lid of his toolbox in the bed. The smell of rust, WD-40, and cold metal filled his nose. He bypassed the wrenches and grabbed his heavy-duty pry bar and a portable high-voltage lithium jump pack he used to crank massive diesel generators. He ran back to the front of the Audi. He didn't care about the car's price tag anymore. It was just a machine in his way. He jammed the flat steel edge of the pry bar into the tight gap between the hood and the front fascia. The matte paint chipped and scraped, screaming as he applied pressure. Tinsley gritted his teeth, hoisted himself up, and threw his entire body weight down onto the bar. Metal groaned. The specialized aluminum latch bent, fighting his weight, and then gave way with a loud, violent crack. The hood popped up an inch. Tinsley threw the pry bar aside, jammed his thick fingers under the heavy lid, and heaved it open. A cloud of white, noxious smoke plumed into his face, smelling strongly of melted plastic and ozone. He coughed, waving the smoke away, his eyes watering as he scanned the chaotic, tightly packed engine bay. It was a maze of plastic covers and warning labels. He found the main power distribution box near the bulkhead. He ripped the plastic cover off with his bare hands, snapping the retaining clips. It was a disaster. The main fusible link had completely melted, turning the surrounding plastic into a blackened, bubbling slag. The short had isolated the battery entirely from the rest of the car's electrical grid to prevent a fire. He couldn't jump the battery. The connection to the car was severed. He needed to feed power directly into the cabin's accessory line, bypassing the blown main fuse. Tinsley grabbed the thick bundle of wires leading through the firewall into the dashboard. He didn't have time to use wire strippers. He found the thickest red wire, likely the main feed for the interior fuse panel, and brought it to his mouth. He clamped his teeth down on the tough rubber insulation and pulled hard. It tasted like bitter chemicals and dirt. He spat the chunk of insulation onto the asphalt, exposing the bright, twisted copper wire underneath. He grabbed the portable jump pack. He clamped the black negative lead onto a bare metal strut tower bolt. "Hang on in there!" he yelled, though he knew she couldn't hear him. He took the red positive clamp. His hands were shaking slightly. If he grounded this out wrong, he'd fry the jumper pack or start an electrical fire right in his hands. He took a breath, steadied his grip, and jammed the teeth of the red clamp directly into the exposed copper wire. Crack! A shower of brilliant blue sparks erupted from the connection, raining down on the plastic engine covers. The smell of burning copper was intense, stinging his nostrils. He held the clamp tight, ignoring the heat radiating through the heavy rubber grips. Inside the cabin, the dashboard flickered violently. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screen strobed to life, glitching through error messages. Tinsley heard a distinct, heavy clunk from the doors as the locking solenoids received the surge of power. He ripped the clamp away, dropping the jump pack into the engine bay, and sprinted to the trunk. He pressed his thumb against the rear emblem. The mechanism whirred weakly, and the trunk popped open an inch. Tinsley threw it up. Inside, sitting on the plush carpet, was a black leather designer purse. He upended it, shaking the contents frantically. Lipsticks, a heavy wallet, loose change, a hairbrush, and finally, a bright yellow plastic tube clattered onto the pavement. He snatched the EpiPen, ran to the driver's door, and pulled the handle. It opened. Kaylee spilled sideways out of the seat, practically falling into his arms. Her skin was clammy, freezing to the touch. Her eyes were rolled back, her breathing reduced to a terrifying, high-pitched wheeze. Tinsley dropped to one knee, catching her heavy weight against his chest. He pulled the blue safety cap off the back of the EpiPen with his teeth. "Hold still," he grunted, though she was entirely limp. He gripped her thigh, feeling the smooth silk of her trousers, and jammed the orange tip of the pen hard into the outer muscle. The mechanism clicked loudly. He held it there, counting out loud in the dark, silent mountain pass. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He pulled the needle away. For 2 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Kaylee remained limp against his flannel shirt, her weight dead and heavy. Tinsley stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs, the grease on his hands smearing across the collar of her expensive blouse. Then Kaylee Madsen inhaled. It was a sharp, ragged, violent gasp, followed by a wet, hacking cough. Her entire body spasmed as the epinephrine slammed into her bloodstream, forcing her constricted airways open. She clutched frantically at Tinsley's shirt, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his shoulders as she dragged oxygen into her starved lungs. Tinsley let out a long, shaky breath, closing his eyes as the cold mountain fog swirled around them. He held her steady as she shuddered, the smell of burnt plastic and spilled apple juice lingering in the dark. Oxygen flooded Kaylee's system like liquid fire. Her chest heaved, pulling in damp, pine-scented air through a throat that felt bruised and raw. Epinephrine was not a gentle cure. It was a violent biological override. Her heart slammed against her ribs with the terrifying speed of a jackhammer, making her vision vibrate. Nausea hit her in a cold, sickening wave. She turned her head, spitting bile and thick saliva onto the wet gravel. Tinsley kept his heavy hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. He didn't speak. He just let her retch and shudder, his face turned slightly away to give her a scrap of dignity. Kaylee rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. She wiped her mouth with the back of a trembling, diamond-ringed hand, smearing dirt across her cheek. You need to sit down before you fall down," Tinsley interrupted, his voice flat. The adrenaline that had propelled him into action was already draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made his joints ache. He stood up, his knees popping, and offered her a thick, grease-stained hand. Kaylee stared at it. 10 minutes ago, the thought of touching this man would have repulsed her. Now, her legs felt like hollow reeds. She reached out, her pale, manicured fingers wrapping around his calloused palm. He pulled her upright with an easy, terrifying strength. The world tilted violently. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming into his chest. He smelled strongly of diesel exhaust, old sweat, and peppermint gum. It was the most comforting thing she had ever inhaled. "My car," she mumbled, leaning heavily against him as he guided her away from the dead Audi. "Your car is a brick," Tinsley said. He didn't look back at it. "Main fuse is fused to the block. Even if you had power, your hood latch is currently living in another zip code. You're riding with us." "I can't leave it. It's—" She swallowed hard, the muscles in her neck spasming. "It's $250,000. Tinsley paused. He looked down at her, his jaw tightening beneath his scruffy beard. "Lady, 5 minutes ago you were dying in a $250,000 coffin. The tow truck can fetch your metal tomorrow. Right now, you're freezing, you're in shock, and I have a kid who needs to get home. Move." He didn't wait for her to argue. He practically dragged her toward the idling F-150. He pulled open the heavy, rusted passenger door. The hinges screamed. A wave of intense, dry heat blasted her face, smelling of melting plastic from the ancient vents, stale French fries, and wet dog. "Scoot over, bug," Tinsley said. A small face peered around the edge of a bulky, faded pink booster seat occupying the middle of the bench. Maya stared at Kaylee with wide, unblinking brown eyes. She had a mop of unruly curls and a smear of something blue on her chin. "Is she a zombie, Daddy?" Maya asked, her voice high and serious. "She looks like a zombie." Kaylee winced, grabbing the grab handle and hauling her trembling body onto the cracked vinyl seat. Her designer silk trousers squeaked against the cheap material. "I am not a zombie," she managed to croak out, though she knew she looked dreadful. Her hair, perfectly blown out hours ago, was plastered to her forehead with cold sweat. Her expensive blouse was torn at the collar and smeared with Tinsley's grease. "Zombies don't wear nice shoes, Maya," Tinsley said tiredly, slamming Kaylee's door shut. He walked around the front of the truck, his boots crunching loudly, and climbed into the driver's seat. The cab was instantly cramped. His broad shoulders brushed against Maya's booster seat, pinning Kaylee against the passenger window. He threw the heavy gear selector into drive. The transmission clunked violently, and the truck lurched forward, spraying gravel. Kaylee huddled against the door, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. The violent shivering had started. The epinephrine crash was setting in, stripping away the artificial warmth and leaving her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She stared out the window as her sleek, dead Audi receded into the darkness, swallowed completely by the mountain fog. She had left her briefcase. She had left her phone. She was completely disconnected from the empire she had built, hurtling down a pitch-black highway in a rusted metal box driven by a man she had screamed at. Internal contradictions warred in her aching head. She was Kaylee Madsen. She dictated terms. She bought companies and dismantled them before breakfast. She did not owe her life to a mechanic in a flannel shirt. The immense, crushing weight of gratitude felt unnatural to her, suffocating and heavy. She wanted to throw money at him. She wanted to write a check with enough zeros to make this awkward intimacy disappear. But her checkbook was in her briefcase, and her briefcase was in the dead car. "Drink this," Tinsley grunted, not taking his eyes off the treacherous, winding road. He thrust a battered aluminum thermos toward her. Kaylee eyed it suspiciously. The outside was dented and wrapped in faded duct tape. "What is it?" "It's not poison," Tinsley muttered, his patience visibly wearing thin. "It's lukewarm coffee. It's terrible, but it's warm. Your lips are blue. Drink." Maya leaned forward against her seatbelt, holding out a crumpled, half-empty pack of fruit snacks. "You can have a red one if you want. They make you feel better when you fall down." Kaylee looked at the little girl, then at the dirty thermos in Tinsley's hand. Her throat burned. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, but the shivering was tearing her muscles apart. Slowly, her shaking hands reached out and took the thermos. She unscrewed the cap. It smelled heavily of burnt beans and cheap artificial creamer. She took a sip. It was lukewarm, bitter, and tasted vaguely of rust. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She took another, longer pull, letting the grim liquid coat her raw throat. She didn't take the fruit snack, but she managed a stiff, jerky nod at Maya. "Thank you. Keep your red ones." The truck rattled over a series of deep potholes, the suspension groaning in agony. Tinsley's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. He hated this. He had planned to be home by 6, to make boxed macaroni and cheese, to sit in his worn recliner and massage the cramps out of his calves. Instead, he was playing ambulance driver to a woman who probably made his annual salary in an afternoon, a woman who had looked at him like he was a piece of trash, right up until the moment her body betrayed her. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She looked small now, huddled against the window, drowning in her expensive, ruined clothes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a fragile, hollowed-out exhaustion. He felt a sudden, irritating twinge of pity. He squashed it down. Pity didn't pay the heating bill. Gravel popped like gunfire against the undercarriage as the F-150 turned off the paved highway and began climbing a steep, heavily rutted logging road. The headlights cut through a thick canopy of Douglas firs, illuminating low-hanging branches that scraped against the windshield with long, screeching sounds. Kaylee gripped the door handle, her knuckles white. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice finally losing some of its rasp, though the panic was creeping back in. "My place," Tinsley said, shifting down into second gear as the truck struggled up a steep incline. There's no cell service anywhere in this valley, and the nearest hospital is 40 miles back the way you came. The pass is closed behind us because of the fog. You're stuck here until morning. Kaylee's stomach plummeted. I can't be stuck here. I have a board meeting at 9 a.m. in Seattle. I need a phone, a landline. Tinsley let out a short, humorless bark of a laugh. Lady, I don't know what century you think you're in, but the phone company stopped servicing the copper lines up here 3 years ago. We use Wi-Fi calling when the satellite internet decides to work, which is about half the time. Then I'll use your Wi-Fi. Sure, Tinsley said smoothly. Just use your phone to connect. Kaylee froze. Her phone. It was sitting on the passenger seat of the Audi, locked inside a dead, impenetrable vault. She closed her eyes, a sharp spike of genuine despair hitting her. She had memorized exactly 0 phone numbers. Her assistant, her lawyers, her private driver. They were all just names on a screen. She was entirely severed from her life. The truck crested the hill and pulled into a small, uneven dirt clearing. A faded yellow single-wide trailer sat perched on cinder blocks, flanked by a towering pile of chopped firewood and a rusted, skeletal swing set that squeaked in the wind. A single weak porch light flickered erratically, casting long, unsettling shadows across the overgrown yard. It wasn't a home. To Kaylee, it looked like a structural failure waiting to happen. The siding was dented, and plastic sheeting covered one of the front windows, flapping loudly in the mountain breeze. Tinsley parked the truck and killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. "All right, Maya, grab your backpack," Tinsley said, his voice instantly softening. He unbuckled the girl, lifted her over the center console, and set her down on the driver's side floorboard so she could climb out. He didn't open Kaylee's door. He just grabbed his heavy metal lunchbox and pushed his way out of the truck. Kaylee sat in the dim cab for a moment, her breath pluming in the rapidly cooling air. The smell of the cheap vinyl and the stale fries suddenly felt suffocating. She opened her door and stepped out. Her high heels immediately sank 2 inches into the wet mud. She let out a frustrated hiss, pulling her foot free, only to have her shoe pop off, leaving her stockinged foot to squelch into the freezing dirt. Tinsley stopped on the porch steps, turning to look back at her. He watched her balance on one leg, swearing under her breath as she dug her ruined designer heel out of the mud. He didn't offer to help. He just unlocked the flimsy aluminum front door and ushered Maya inside. Kaylee limped across the yard, her feet freezing, her body still humming with the aftershocks of the epinephrine. She pushed through the door. The inside of the trailer smelled heavily of cheap pine cleaner, damp wood, and old cooking oil. The living room was the size of her walk-in closet in her penthouse. A threadbare brown sofa sat facing a bulky, outdated television. The carpet was a faded, heavily stained beige. Everywhere she looked, there was clutter. Stacks of unpaid bills on a tiny laminate kitchen table, half-assembled Lego sets, a pile of folded laundry resting on a broken dining chair. It was chaotic. It was poor. It made her skin crawl. "Sit," Tinsley commanded, pointing a greasy finger at the sofa. Kaylee didn't move. She stood near the doorway, awkwardly holding her mud-caked shoe. "I don't want to impose. If you just let me use your internet on a computer—" "I don't own a computer," Tinsley said, pulling off his heavy boots and tossing them into a corner. "And the satellite dish got knocked out by the wind yesterday. I haven't had time to climb on the roof and fix it. You're entirely off the grid." Kaylee stared at him, panic rising in her chest again. "That's impossible. People don't just live off the grid." "Welcome to reality," Tinsley muttered. He walked into the tiny galley kitchen, running the tap water until it stopped spitting brown rust and ran clear. He filled a dented kettle and set it on the ancient electric stove. "Maya, go put your pajamas on. Brush your teeth. Spit in the cup, not the sink. The drain is backed up again." Maya scurried down the narrow, dark hallway, her light-up sneakers flashing against the dingy carpet. Tinsley turned back to Kaylee. She was still standing by the door, shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked completely out of place. A sleek, injured bird dropped into a dirty cage. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face, feeling the grit of the day grinding into his skin. He walked down the hall and returned a moment later with a heavy, faded plaid blanket. He tossed it at her. Kaylee caught it clumsily. It smelled strongly of cheap laundry detergent and dust, but it was thick. "Take your wet shoes off," Tinsley ordered, leaning against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms over his chest. "Wrap up. The baseboard heaters in here are shot, so the wood stove is the only thing keeping us from freezing. It'll take 20 minutes to warm the room up." Kaylee wanted to argue. She wanted to demand a car, a ride, a helicopter. But as she opened her mouth, a violent shudder racked her frame, rattling her teeth together so hard she bit her tongue. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a stark, terrifying vulnerability. She dropped her shoes onto the linoleum, walked rigidly to the threadbare sofa, and sat down. The cushions sagged heavily beneath her weight, swallowing her. She wrapped the scratchy plaid blanket tightly around her shoulders, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Tinsley watched her, his expression unreadable. He turned back to the stove as the kettle began to whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that filled the small, suffocating space. Flames caught the dry edges of a cedar log, snapping loudly inside the belly of the rusted cast-iron stove. Tinsley shoved the heavy metal door shut with the toe of his boot, the iron squealing on dry hinges. He stood up, wiping his soot-stained hands on his thighs, and adjusted the damper. The sudden draft of heat smelled of wood ash and old soot. It crept across the stained beige carpet, eventually wrapping around Kaylee's freezing ankles. She pulled the scratchy plaid blanket tighter beneath her chin. The wool blend was stiff, smelling faintly of mildew and cheap lavender detergent. Every nerve in her body felt frayed, exposed to the air. The lingering cocktail of synthetic adrenaline and terror left a metallic, sour taste pooling under her tongue. Tinsley moved around the narrow kitchen with an economy of motion, dictated by exhaustion. He ripped open 2 generic, paper-wrapped tea bags and tossed them into a pair of mismatched ceramic mugs. One had a chipped rim, the other bore the faded logo of a defunct local hardware store. He poured the boiling water, the steam rising to fog the grimy window above the sink. He walked over and extended the chipped mug toward her. Kaylee hesitated. Her manicured fingers, still smeared with dirt and axle grease, reached out from beneath the blanket. The ceramic was blisteringly hot. She winced but didn't let go, desperate to siphon the heat into her icy palms. "Careful," Tinsley grunted, turning his back on her and moving toward his worn recliner. "It's cheap black tea. No sugar. Ran out on Tuesday." "Thank you," she rasped. The words tasted strange. Gratitude was not a currency she traded in. In her world, you paid for services rendered. You didn't owe people. Debt was leverage, and she despised giving anyone leverage. She brought the mug to her lips. The steam burned her nose. The liquid was bitter, aggressively oversteeped, and tasted vaguely of the rusty tap water. It coated her raw throat like liquid sandpaper, but it carried warmth deep into her chest, thawing the ice lodged behind her ribs. "I need to compensate you," Kaylee said, the silence in the trailer becoming unbearable. Her corporate instincts, bruised and battered, tried to reassert control. "For the EpiPen, for breaking my hood latch, for this." Tinsley collapsed heavily into his recliner. The faux leather cracked and wheezed under his weight. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back. "Keep your money. I am serious. That car was locked down. You forced a bypass. You clearly have mechanical expertise. I can write you a check that will—" She glanced around the cramped, dim room, her eyes lingering on the plastic sheeting duct-taped over the window. "That will make a significant difference." Tinsley opened one eye. The ambient light from the wood stove cast deep, weary shadows across his face. He didn't look impressed. He looked annoyed. "Lady, your money is locked inside a 2-ton paperweight down on the pass. Right now, you don't have a dime to your name. You're just a woman wearing ruined shoes sitting on my couch." The bluntness hit her like a physical blow. She stiffened, her jaw clenching. Nobody spoke to her like that. Not her board of directors, not her competitors. Certainly not a man who lived in a tin box on cinder blocks. Before she could form a sufficiently cutting response, the rhythmic pad of footsteps sounded down the short hallway. Maya emerged, dressed in faded, pill-covered fleece pajamas adorned with cartoon dogs. The sleeves were a fraction too short, exposing her thin wrists. She carried a ratty, one-eyed stuffed bear under her arm. "Daddy, the sink is making the gurgle noise again," Maya announced, climbing up onto the armrest of Tinsley's chair. Tinsley sighed, rubbing a heavy hand over his face. "I'll snake the drain tomorrow, Bug. Did you brush?" Maya opened her mouth and exhaled a dramatic puff of air toward his nose. "Minty. Smells like a swamp," he teased gently, wrapping a thick arm around her waist and pulling her into his lap. The deep, rumbling chuckle that vibrated in his chest was a sound Kaylee hadn't heard yet. It held a warmth that entirely contradicted the cynical, hardened mechanic who had yanked her from her dying car. Maya rested her head against his shoulder, her dark eyes locking onto Kaylee. The child's stare was intense, entirely devoid of the polite filters adults used. "Why is your shirt ripped?" Maya asked, pointing a small finger at Kaylee's chest. Kaylee looked down. The Tom Ford silk blouse, which cost more than this man probably made in 2 weeks, was torn at the collarbone. Smears of dark grease ruined the pale cream fabric, leaving fingerprints that mirrored Tinsley's desperate grip when he had jammed the needle into her leg. "I had an accident," Kaylee said stiffly. "Your father helped me." "Are you poor now?" Maya asked, tilting her head. "Because your shoes are all muddy." "Maya, enough," Tinsley warned softly, though he didn't apologize for the child. "Bedtime. Say good night." "Good night, zombie lady," Maya mumbled, already half asleep, her thumb finding its way into her mouth. Tinsley stood, carrying the girl effortlessly down the hall. The door clicked shut. Left alone in the dim living room, Kaylee stared at the flickering light of the stove. "Are you poor now?" The child's innocent, brutal question echoed in her head. For the first time in 10 years, she felt utterly stripped of her armor. The bank accounts, the properties, the ruthless reputation. None of it existed within these aluminum walls. Out here, in the freezing dark, she was nothing more than a fragile biological organism that had nearly suffocated on a cashew. Her stomach gave a sudden, violent, hollow growl. The sound was obscenely loud in the quiet trailer. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, flushing with embarrassment. She had eaten half of that damned energy bar at 6 a.m. It was now past 8 at night. Silence settled heavily over the small trailer once the bedroom door clicked shut. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling fiercely through the branches of the towering fir trees. The plastic sheeting taped over the front window snapped and billowed inward, a constant, irritating percussion. Tinsley walked back into the living room, picking up his empty mug. He heard Kaylee's stomach rumble a second time. She shifted uncomfortably on the sagging cushions, refusing to meet his eyes, staring fixedly at the rusted metal grate of the wood stove. He didn't say a word. He walked into the tiny galley kitchen, opened a narrow faux wood cabinet, and pulled down a familiar blue cardboard box. Kaylee watched him out of the corner of her eye. The loud rattle of dry pasta hitting a cheap aluminum pot was unmistakable. She felt a bizarre wave of cognitive dissonance. She regularly dined at establishments where the tasting menu cost $500. The idea of eating boxed macaroni and cheese repulsed her palate, yet her body practically vibrated with desperate hunger. "You don't have to cook," Kaylee lied, her voice tight. "I'm fine." "You're shaking," Tinsley replied, not turning around. He turned the dial on the electric stove. The ancient coil clicked, hissed, and slowly began to glow a dull orange. "Your body just went through a war. It burned through whatever glucose you had left, fighting off that shock. If you don't eat, you're going to pass out on my floor, and I am too tired to drag you onto the couch." He grabbed a wooden spoon, its handle darkened by years of hot oil and boiling water, and stirred the pasta. The small space quickly filled with the heavy, starchy smell of boiling noodles. 10 minutes later, Tinsley drained the water into the sputtering sink and dumped in a splash of milk, a lump of cheap margarine, and the packet of violently neon orange cheese powder. The acrid, chemical scent of artificial cheddar hit the air. He spooned the thick, sticky mass into 2 mismatched plastic bowls. He walked over, handing the slightly warped blue bowl to Kaylee, along with a bent aluminum spoon. "5-star dining," he muttered, taking his own red bowl back to the recliner. Kaylee looked down at the food. It was a dense, glowing orange mound. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of salt and fake butter. She dug the bent spoon in and took a tentative bite. The heat scalded her tongue, but the rush of simple carbohydrates and heavy sodium hit her bloodstream like a drug. It was salty, incredibly soft, and utterly devoid of complex flavor. It was the best thing she had eaten in a year. She didn't speak. She just ate, her metallic spoon scraping loudly against the plastic bowl as she devoured the meal with a primitive, uncharacteristic urgency. Tinsley watched her quietly as he ate his own portion. The frantic energy of the rescue had entirely left him, replaced by the dull, throbbing ache in his lower lumbar spine. He shifted in the recliner, trying to find an angle that didn't pinch his sciatic nerve. "So," Tinsley said, his voice cutting through the sound of the wind and the snapping fire, "what does someone who drives a car that costs more than my entire life do for a living?" Kaylee paused, the spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. She swallowed the heavy bite, wiping her lips with the back of her wrist. The defensive wall slammed instantly back into place. "I work in corporate restructuring." Tinsley snorted, a short, humorless sound. "Restructuring? That's a nice, clean word. What does it mean? You fire people?" "I optimize struggling assets," Kaylee corrected, her tone icing over. She sat up straighter, ignoring the scratch of the blanket against her neck. "I find companies that are bleeding capital due to bloat and mismanagement, and I streamline their operations to return them to profitability." "Right, you fire people," Tinsley repeated, scraping the last bit of orange pasta from his bowl. "You take a place that's keeping a town alive, you gut it, you sell off the machines, and you leave the workers holding the bag while the shareholders get a fat dividend. I know how optimizing works. I used to maintain the HVAC systems for a textile mill up in Everett. Suits came in one day, talked about restructuring. 2 weeks later, doors were padlocked. 300 guys out of work. The number hit Kaylee like a physical jolt. 300. Exactly the number she had liquidated that very morning in Ohio. She looked at Tinsley. She looked at his grease-stained hands, the dark circles under his eyes, the frayed edges of his flannel shirt. He was exactly the kind of collateral damage her spreadsheets so clinically accounted for. He was a line item, a redundancy. "It's economics," Kaylee said, though her voice lacked its usual sharp, cutting edge. "If a business isn't profitable, it dies. My firm just accelerates the inevitable so capital can be redeployed into viable sectors." "Must be nice," Tinsley said quietly, setting his empty bowl on the floor. "What, to live in the sky?" he murmured, closing his eyes, exhaustion finally pulling his features down. To look at a balance sheet and not see the mortgages, not see the kids who need braces or the heating bills. Must be nice to play God and call it math. He didn't sound angry. He just sounded incredibly, profoundly tired. Kaylee stared at him, the plastic bowl suddenly heavy in her hands. She waited for the punchline, for the righteous indignation, for him to use his position of power, the man who held the keys to her survival tonight, to berate her. But he didn't. He didn't care enough to fight her. He had saved her life, fed her his cheap food, and now he was just going to sleep in his broken chair. The wind howled outside, violently shaking the thin aluminum walls of the trailer. The plastic sheet over the window snapped like a whip. Inside, the fire cracked, sending a shower of orange sparks against the blackened glass of the stove. Kaylee pulled her knees up to her chest beneath the itchy blanket. The nausea from the EpiPen had faded, replaced by a crushing, unnatural fatigue. Her eyelids felt like they were made of lead. She lay back against the armrest of the terrible, lumpy sofa. The smell of artificial cheese and stale wood smoke clung to her skin. She closed her eyes, trying to picture her sleek, sterile penthouse in Seattle. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the quiet, climate-controlled hum of the city far below. But the image wouldn't hold. All she could see were the deep cracks permanently etched into Tinsley's knuckles and the way he had held his daughter. "Thank you," she whispered into the dim room. Tinsley didn't answer. The slow, rhythmic sound of his deep breathing told her he was already asleep. Kaylee lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm tear at the trailer, feeling the heat of the fire slowly begin to die. Grey light crept through the plastic sheeting over the window, casting a sickly, diffused glow across the cramped living room. Kaylee woke to a profound, aching stiffness in her neck and the taste of stale copper in her mouth. The fire in the wood stove had died hours ago, leaving the trailer bitterly cold. She pulled the scratchy plaid blanket up to her chin, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar, dingy space as the terrifying memories of the previous night slammed back into her conscious mind. The violent lack of air, the sharp, brutal jab of the needle, the artificial orange pasta. She sat up, her spine popping in protest. The threadbare sofa cushions groaned. Tinsley's rusted recliner sat empty, slightly reclined, a faded quilt tossed haphazardly over the armrest. The trailer was utterly silent, save for the faint, erratic hum of the ancient refrigerator in the galley kitchen. Kaylee swung her legs off the sofa. Her stockinged feet hit the freezing linoleum floor. She shivered, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders like a shawl. Her expensive Tom Ford blouse was hopelessly ruined, stiff with dried grease and sweat. She felt feral, entirely disconnected from the polished, untouchable executive who had driven up this mountain yesterday. She walked toward the kitchen, driven by a dry, aching thirst. As she reached for a cracked glass near the sink, her eyes fell upon the small laminate dining table. It was covered in a chaotic, desperate geometry of paperwork. In her world, paperwork meant leverage. It meant multi-million-dollar acquisitions, legally binding non-disclosure agreements, and severance packages. Here, the paperwork was a stark, bleeding wound. She saw a past due notice from the Rural Electric Cooperative printed on cheap pink paper. Beneath it lay a collection agency letter regarding an unpaid emergency room bill. At the center of the pile was a foreclosure warning, the bold black ink screaming the total amount required to keep the bank from taking the cinder block-supported trailer and the patch of dirt it sat on, $4,280. Kaylee stared at the number. It was an offensive, trivial sum. She had spent more than that on the custom carbon fiber steering wheel in her Audi. She spent twice that amount on quarterly maintenance for her vacation home in Aspen, a home she hadn't visited in 2 years. To Tinsley, that number was a guillotine hanging over his daughter's head. She reached out, her manicured finger brushing the coarse paper of the foreclosure notice. A wave of intense, suffocating nausea rolled through her gut, entirely unrelated to the epinephrine crash. It was the sickening realization of her own insulation. She had spent her entire adult life playing a high-stakes game with numbers on a screen, ruthlessly optimizing the ledgers. She had never once smelled the stale, desperate sweat of the people buried beneath those numbers. The heavy thud of boots on the porch broke the silence. The aluminum door clicked open. Tinsley stepped inside, bringing a rush of freezing mountain air with him. His face was pale, his beard frosted with morning dew. He looked worse than he had last night. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles underneath bruised and heavy. He stopped when he saw her standing by the table. His gaze flicked down to the scattered bills, then back up to her face. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering near his ear. He didn't yell. He didn't snatch the papers away. He just walked past her, his heavy boots leaving clumps of wet mud on the linoleum. "I hiked up to the ridge," Tinsley said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He opened the refrigerator, pulling out a plastic jug of generic orange juice. "Got 1 bar of signal. Called the county dispatch. The pass is clear. They're sending a flatbed tow truck up from the valley. Should be at your car in 20 minutes. "Tinsley," Kaylee started, her voice catching on the dry air. "Don't," he interrupted, pouring the juice into a faded plastic cup. He didn't look at her. "Don't do the pity thing. I don't want to hear it. Maya's still asleep. I'll drive you down to your car. You give the tow guy the keys, and you go back to Seattle. We're done." He drank the juice in one long swallow, slammed the cup onto the counter, and grabbed his keys from a rusty hook by the door. "Put your shoes on," he ordered. Kaylee didn't argue. The harsh, uncompromising tone left no room for negotiation. She found her ruined designer heels near the sofa. The mud from the night before had dried into a stiff, chalky crust. She forced her swollen, aching feet into the rigid leather, wincing at the pinch. She left the plaid blanket folded neatly on the cushions and followed him out into the biting morning air. The drive down the rutted logging road was agonizingly quiet. The rusted F-150's suspension squealed over every dip, tossing Kaylee against the hard vinyl door panel. Daylight did nothing to soften the harshness of the landscape. The towering pines looked oppressive, the grey sky pressing down heavily on the mountain pass. When they rounded the final blind curve onto Highway 20, the Audi came into view. In the cold light of day, the $250,000 hypercar didn't look sleek or powerful. It looked pathetic. The matte graphite paint was covered in a fine layer of road grit and morning frost. The hood was violently bent, jutting up at a grotesque angle where Tinsley had forced the latch with his pry bar. It was just a dead, heavy piece of metal blocking the shoulder. A massive yellow flatbed tow truck was already idling behind it, amber lights flashing rhythmically against the dense tree line. The driver, a stout man in a high-visibility jacket, was hooking heavy steel chains to the Audi's undercarriage. Tinsley pulled his truck up behind the flatbed and threw the gear selector into park. He didn't cut the engine. The diesel rattle filled the cab. "This is you," Tinsley said, staring straight ahead through the dirty windshield. Kaylee sat motionless for a fraction of a second. Her chest felt incredibly tight. The armor was sliding back into place, the corporate executive persona demanding she take control of the situation, exchange pleasantries, and assert her dominance over the transaction. But her body refused to cooperate. Her hands trembled in her lap. "I looked at your table," Kaylee said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Her voice was uncharacteristically quiet, stripped of all its boardroom authority. "The foreclosure. It's $4,000. Tinsley's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I told you. Don't." "I am going to pay it," she stated, her tone shifting, catching a hard edge of determination. "It's not charity. It's a transaction. You bypassed a locked system, provided emergency medical intervention, and offered shelter. In my world, consultants charge 10 times that for an hour of bad advice. Give me your bank routing number." Tinsley turned his head slowly. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, cutting anger. "I don't want your money." "That is mathematically stupid," Kaylee snapped, her own temper flaring, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming vulnerability she felt. "You are going to lose your house over a fraction of what I make in a day. Take the goddamn money." "It's not about the math," Tinsley yelled, the sudden volume making Kaylee flinch. He leaned across the wide console, his face inches from hers. He smelled of cold sweat and bitter coffee. "It's never been about the math. You think you can just write a check and wipe the slate clean? You think handing me $4,000 makes you a good person? It just makes you comfortable again. It means you don't have to owe a grease monkey a favor. It means you can go back to your penthouse and pretend the rest of us don't exist." Kaylee held her breath. The words struck her with brutal, undeniable accuracy. She wanted to buy her way out of the guilt. She wanted to erase the memory of choking on her own arrogance. "I saved your life because you were dying," Tinsley said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Not because I wanted a payout. I did it because I'm human. Try being one sometime." He leaned back, putting the truck into gear. "Get out." Kaylee's throat worked. But no words came. The absolute, crushing weight of his rejection pinned her to the cracked vinyl seat. Slowly, clumsily, she opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the damp asphalt. She closed the door. The rusted hinges screamed one final time. Tinsley didn't wait. He didn't look back. He pressed the accelerator, the diesel engine roaring as the F-150 pulled away, trailing a thick cloud of black exhaust. Kaylee stood shivering on the highway shoulder, watching the battered tailgate disappear around the bend. "Mom!" Kaylee jumped, turning to see the tow truck driver standing near the cab of his flatbed, holding out a familiar, rectangular piece of glass. "Got the door popped with a Slim Jim. Found your phone on the seat. Assumed you'd want it." Kaylee took the phone. The screen was black. She pressed the power button. Instantly, the device vibrated violently in her palm. The screen illuminated, blindingly bright in the grey morning. The notifications cascaded down the glass like a waterfall. 142 missed calls. 78 unread emails. Urgent. Board meeting commencing. Urgent. Restructuring liquidations pending approval. The noise of her world flooded back in, demanding her attention, demanding her ruthlessness. Her thumb hovered over the screen, ready to swipe, ready to open the email and authorize the closure of the Ohio plant. It was just math. 300 people. Line items. She looked up. Her eyes fell on the bent, ruined hood of her $250,000 car. She saw the deep gouges in the aluminum where Tinsley had thrown his entire body weight onto a steel bar to pry open a vault she had built to keep the world out. She looked back down at the screen. Restructuring liquidations. Pending approval. Kaylee's thumb trembled. The cold mountain wind whipped her ruined silk blouse against her skin. The smell of diesel exhaust still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of wet pine. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she felt the absolute, suffocating darkness of a closed airway. She remembered the sheer, desperate panic of having nothing but her own fragile biology left to rely on. She opened her eyes. The phone screen glared back at her. Kaylee pressed her thumb against the glass. She didn't approve the file. She swiped left. She hit delete. She didn't know how she was going to explain it to the board. She didn't know how she was going to fix the massive hole she had just blown in her own quarterly projections. It wasn't a heroic gesture. It wouldn't save Tinsley Guthrie's house. It was just a small, terrifying crack in a foundation she had spent her life building. "You riding in the cab, Ma'am?" the driver asked, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. "Yes," Kaylee said, her voice sounding hollow, yet entirely steady. She walked toward the tow truck, her ruined shoes crunching on the gravel. She didn't look back at the Audi as the heavy chains pulled it up onto the flatbed. She just climbed into the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, feeling the cold, uncomfortable weight of being human. If you felt the raw tension of this story, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button to show your support, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply grounded, emotional stories that strip away the armor and reveal the brutal reality beneath. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the biggest saves don't come from heroes in capes, but from exhausted people just trying to get by. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the check? Let's get a discussion going.